You're on.
Hi, everyone. My name is Akhil Gopal, part of Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. Welcome to our coalition meeting for the fight against the war on youth. This is our second Tuesday meeting. The first Tuesday is dedicated to gender and sexuality and surveillance. The third Tuesday is a general coalition meeting, and the last Tuesday is about data-driven policing. But this one is about the fight against the war on youth. And just a few things of housekeeping. Everybody is muted right now, and the chat is to the host only because we've been Zoom bombed really regularly, especially in this meeting. So we will open up the chat later when we have a more interactive discussion. But even before that, if you have anything that you'd like to ask or any comments or questions, you can feel free to message one of the hosts or raise your hand and, through Zoom, and we can unmute you. And the outline for, oh, and also we are recording today, and the recording does go up on YouTube under the coalition's YouTube account. And it also goes on the coalition's website, and you can access all the previous recordings of previous meetings there too. And so the outline today is that I'll do a quick overview of what the campaign is right now, and then I'll toss it to PYM and our special guest, Nada from Coalition for Civil Freedoms. So the campaign, and then after that, we'll do a collective analysis and reading of two risk assessment tools, one used by LAUSD School Threat Assessment Response Team, and the other one used by the GRYD, or Gang Reduction and Youth Development Office of the Mayor. So quick overview of the programs and what we're fighting in this campaign. Basically, we're fighting CVE and its related program. CVE stands for Countering Violent Extremism, and it's a program that originates in the federal government and the Department of Homeland Security. And basically it and its related programs like Preventing Violent Extremism offer grants to community organizations, to educators, to mental health professionals, to basically institutions where there is some kind of trusted authority, including even religious institutions, and basically try to either coerce or compel or invite coalition to, communities to snitch on each other and snitch on members within the community, and sows distrust, and it particularly targets Muslim, Black, Arab, Palestinian, Latinx, immigrant, Native communities, and especially youth. So these are the constellations of programs and frameworks that we fight in this campaign, and it's co-led between Stop LAPD Spying Coalition and Palestinian Youth Movement, alongside other campaigns that are also led by Vigilant Love and Muslim Justice League around the country. So that's basically the overview of the campaign. So our theme today is Prisoners of the War on Terror. So to discuss this topic and to discuss specifically the way that this has manifested in the Palestinian liberation movement and targeting of Palestinian youth and communities, I'm going to toss it first to Celine and to PYM, and then Coalition for Civil Freedoms with Nada. Go for it.
Sure, yeah, you mostly covered it, Akhil. Just to say that we're also really looking at how these surveillance programs are being implemented in K through 12 in schools and the education system. And just to share a little bit about PYM, our grassroots movement organization of Palestinian Arab youth, who are, organizing to activate and politically engage in our community, to assume a role in our struggle. And our local organizing just looks like, offering, like doing political education sessions, student organizing support, organizing campaigns like our joint anti-CVE campaign, so local campaigns to confront Zionism and surveillance. And we're basically just a political home for Palestinian and Arab youth. So I'll just pass it to Fatima, who's going to kind of give us an overview about the Palestinian Prisoners movement, and then introduce our speaker for today, Nada from the Coalition for Civil.
Hi, my name is Fatima. I'm also a member of the PYM LAUSD chapter, and I'll be introducing the Coalition for Civil Freedoms and the importance of Palestinian prisoners movement. Before we begin, I'd like to share a little bit about why we in the PYM believe that we need to center prisoners in the Palestinian liberation struggle. Palestinian prisoners embody the national struggle, as Palestinian prisoners are in daily confrontation with the Zionist entity or so-called Israel. Every facet of life becomes a battle for dignity: food, water, clothing, healthcare, and more. In this way, they represent the whole nation in captivity. For Palestinians living in occupied Palestine, the experience of imprisonment is as common as military checkpoints, Zionist settlements, and land confiscations. The Zionist policy of imprisoning Palestinians en masse intensified after 1967 with the Nakba, and more than 800,000 Palestinians have been imprisoned by the occupation since. From 1967 till now, in the West Bank and Gaza alone, over 800,000 Palestinians have been incarcerated by the Zionist entity, which is about 20% of the total population. There are 1,488 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, about 424 of whom are in administrative detention. Administrative detention serves as a major mechanism of Zionist imprisonment. Administrative detention is a preemptive measure based on the presumption that a suspect is likely to pose a threat in the future and therefore must be detained. The current Zionist entity statute is based on the colonial British mandate's emergency regulations. Hundreds of Palestinians are in administrative detention at any given time without charge or trial. The objectives of the style of imprisonment are to isolate Palestinian freedom fighters and dissidents from the rest of Palestinian society and pacify their nationalist aspirations. The prison guard tries to separate the inmates from one another, so the inmates respond by struggling to become closer together. The isolated interiors of the separate prisons, along with their inhabitants, grew into a national political movement through the rebuilding of communal networks among the captives. The formal institutions of the PLO named this organized collectivity of the Palestinians in the Israeli prisons the Palestinian Prisoners movement. In the prisons where the mind and the body are the sole weapons at the disposal of the inmates, Palestinian prisoners built the Palestinian Prisoners movement, which encompassed all initiatives made by them to resist the Zionist prison system. For communication, small capsules became an important method for transferring knowledge in and out of the prisons and were sometimes even swallowed. Cigarette papers were passed between prisoners to send messages. For revolutionary schools, educational programs have been organized in the prisons, teaching history, foreign languages, political theory, and more. This included the production of magazines and the dissemination of notebooks featuring poetry and other literary texts. Palestinian prisoners have also organized mass hunger strikes to protest the injustices of the colonial authority. The demands of hunger strikes include visitation rights, proper medical care, end to solitary confinement, end to administrative detention, and access to education. On April 17, 2017, 1,500 Palestinian prisoners launched a hunger strike which lasted 40 days, surviving only on salt and water, to pressure the Zionist entity to comply with its international obligations to improve prison conditions. Finally, there's little time to go over why Oslo was a setback for the Palestinian struggle, but briefly I'm going to talk about the Oslo Accords and the Palestinian Authority that was created from it was an instrument of Palestinian surrender, as Edward Said described it. The Palestinian Authority has served as an enforcer of security for the Zionist entity, dismantling resistance groups and imprisoning Palestinian armed struggles. The security collaboration between the Palestinian Authority and the Zionist entity can be characterized by the revolving door policy, where essentially Palestinians who are imprisoned by the Palestinian Authority are released only to land in Zionist jails shortly after. The revolving door policy fully represents the normalization and collaboration of the Palestinian Authority with the Zionist entity, which we condemn and reject. The revolutionary Basil al-Araj, who led a youth movement against normalization with the Zionist entity, was imprisoned by the Palestinian Authority and subject to torture. He was hiding from the occupation army before they located his whereabouts, and he was killed after engaging in a final armed confrontation with the army. Khalid al-Jarrar, member of the Palestinian Legislative Council, was rearrested by Israel for the third time back in fall 2019. Her last release from Israeli prison was in last February, after she spent 20 months in administrative detention. We also know that Zionism does not only impact Palestinians within occupied Palestine. It is an imperialist project that impacts all oppressed peoples and is part of the broader systems and legacies of settler colonialism, imperialism, militarism, and endless war. In the US, Zionism, especially with the onset of the war on terror, has facilitated the imprisonment of many Palestinian Arab and Muslim community members who are active in their communities and or politically, and it is these prisoners who the Coalition for Civil Freedoms supports. Coalition for Civil Freedoms is a survivor-led nonprofit organization that seeks to end the abuses of the war on terror while supporting current and former prisoners and their families. Founded in 2010 by a former political prisoner while under house arrest, CCF is a coalition of 12 organizations that challenges governmental overreach and the post-9/11 targeting, surveillance, and criminalization of Muslims by federal law enforcement. Coalition for Civil Freedoms work includes education and outreach, legal services, advocacy, research and tracking, policy, and grassroots advocacy. We amplify the voices of those directly impacted and empower them to advocate for meaningful change. Through direct action and education, Coalition for Civil Freedoms mobilizes communities to demand an end to political repression and the transformation of the criminal justice system to build on fairness. Nada Debas, our speaker for tonight, is a Palestinian Muslim based in San Diego. She graduated from UC Berkeley in May 2020 with a BA in political science. Before joining the Coalition for Civil Freedoms team, Nada worked with American Friends Service Committee, researching companies profiting from incarceration. She also worked as a tutor at San Quentin State Prison. Empowering and supporting prisoners is work that she holds very close to her heart. Because Nada believes prisoners are the most vulnerable and most valuable part of all liberation movement, justice for prisoners will always be at the center of her work. Nada is dedicated to seeing our loved ones come home, and she is honored to be able to do the work that supports them through their homecoming. So with that, I'll pass it on to Nada.
Hi everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me. First of all, Ramadan Mubarak, and for all of you fasting, inshallah I don't make it too hard for you all to listen to me speak. But yeah, hopefully we can end soon so that you guys can, go and have iftar with your families for those of you that are fasting. Yeah, so I want to tell you guys a little bit about CCF, the work that we do, the work that I do with CCF, and then just some of the cases that we've worked on, and so on and so forth, and ways to support our work and the prisoners that we work with. So like Fatma mentioned, we're a survivor-led organization, and we basically work with prisoners who are victims of war on terror policies, and also we work with their families. So our work pretty much looks like education and outreach. If you follow our social medias, you'll see a bunch of the webinars that we do, in which we have we discuss very important topics with relevant speakers and have them, speak to their own experiences and so forth. We also provide legal services. We have two amazing part-time attorneys that help us figure out different legal issues that our prisoners are facing, as well as, helping their families navigate that. So yeah, we do a lot of different types of work. We also have done policy and grassroots work. And before COVID happened, we were planning on doing a Florida regional conference to try to connect families of prisoners with their local communities to try to get them to be able to advocate for themselves and their own families within like certain communities, just so to strengthen that work, because we are very scattered and we are all over the country. So that's inshallah work that we intend on doing in the future, and that you can hopefully be involved in once, you know, the pandemic permits and we can get together and gather and have these regional conferences where we can meet with families. Can you guys hear me? Yes, okay.
Yeah.
I'm so worried that my internet's gonna start cutting out, but yeah, okay. So yeah, hopefully you guys can start doing that work with us once we are ready to do that. We've also, we host a yearly family conference with our family members where we have them get together, and this year we got to do it virtually, but we go through many different types of workshops, and we also will usually in some way, shape, or form connect them with some type of mental health resources. We've also really anything that our families and prisoners need, whenever they ask for it, we find a way to like help them navigate into it. We don't have like a specific, like, you know, this is what we do. We really do everything under the sun is how I feel about it. For me personally, I'm the CCF Prisoner and Family Support Coordinator. So I work directly with the over 240 prisoners that we have on our, what we call a Ramadan list. And I work with their families. And what that means is I basically gauge what they need, what resources they need, and I kind of try to navigate or facilitate some type of connection between them and the resource or whatever it may be. And if there's any like sort of like abuse or issue that's happening, I try to help the family also navigate that. And I work with our lawyers and I'll, you know, contact the prisoner or do whatever needs to be done to hopefully try to find a remedy for it. Yeah, we also recently gave out $100 to each of our prisoners that was collected by the generous donations of, you know, all of you or just people in general who were willing to donate. And we give our prisoners every Ramadan $100 like as a gift. So our work really ranges between like financial support and really everything else. And I'll tell you guys more about the pen pal program that you know we're working on towards the end of this. That's something that you guys can join and be a part of. Yeah, so the prisoners that we work with over 240 political prisoners. Our definition of political prisoner is a person who was targeted criminally prosecuted and imprisoned due to their political views, beliefs, cultural identity, or activism. So more explicitly, we work with prisoners who were convicted of terrorism or are being prosecuted on like terrorism charges. So you can also say that they're the modern day victims of COINTELPRO, a lot of them are targets of informants and, you know, FBI entrapment cases. Yeah, and so I guess you can say that the prisoners that we work with are prisoners that most people shy from working with, and we've seen, or we do see, the most radical of organizations try to distance themselves from, you know, from this issue just because of what it implies for them or the hardship that comes with being associated with this, or just the fear, the general fear of it. So why is it important to center prisoners in the Palestinian liberation struggle? Fatima touched up on this a little bit, but I think it's important to center prisoners in every struggle. Honestly, I think prisoners are, you know, the most important part of any movement for liberation. You could say that when we're fighting for freedom and you look to our prisoners, they're the ones that are literally in shackles. So like while we have, you know, we face all these different types of issues, they face issues that are, you know, they're the ones that are literally between, you know, four walls in a cell, locked up and shackled. So I think achieving freedom for our prisoners and supporting them is probably one of the most important things that we can do. I also think that it's so sorry, I feel like my computer is about to, like, I don't know. Oh, sorry. Okay, so yeah, basically I think when it comes to prisoners, it's also it's a very hidden issue. So making it the center of our work, or making sure that we're, you know, amplifying and you know, looking towards our prisoners for guidance and what to do is a very important part, because I think, you know, they're being imprisoned, their imprisonment, I think, is the ultimate consequence that you could say, as far as you know, activism and organizing goes. So looking towards them for support and help is, I think, one of the most important things that we can do. You know, it was Huey Newton that said you can jail the revolutionary, but you can't jail the revolution. And so I think it's an important part of making sure that we're not, that the revolution continues, is that, you know, we use their voices, because at the end of the day, while you can't jail the revolution, it's definitely, you know, imprisonment and putting people in prison is a tactic used by the government to weaken us. So by, you know, drawing on our prisoners, we strengthen our own movement. So it's really important that we do that. Yeah, and so now, as far as war on terror impacts on Palestinian organizing and you know, on Arabs and Muslims in the United States, the war on terror really, you know, the biggest impact that it's had on organizers and even non-organizers, just Muslims and, you know, other Arabs who are just going about their regular day, is, you can say that, you know, is the surveillance aspect of it. Our communities are being constantly surveilled, and that has very severe impacts on our communities. As far as, you know, there's so many different types of impacts, but at the same time, the ultimate impact being, you know, all of these entrapment cases that are happening with just like regular everyday people who are sometimes literally in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yeah, so I think also, like, something else to consider, you know, when I said that prisoners are basically, or people are shying away from working with these specific types of prisoners, it's really important to, like, remember that this is like one of the effects of surveillance. It's like what Foucault says is you know, surveillance is permanent in its effects. It's basically made so that you are now scared to engage in this work, or you're scared to do this work because you don't know if you're being watched or you're not being watched. So it creates this, what Foucault calls a panopticon effect, which, I mean, I'm not going to go into too much details, but basically it means that you are always in fear of being watched. You don't know if you're being watched or not. So you kind of start to change your own behavior and to police yourself, because you just might as well be being watched at that given point, but you don't really know. There's no way to know for certain. So there's something else that a film that I would recommend that you watch to, like, learn more about, like, the impacts of surveillance on our communities. It would be the film called The Feeling of Being Watched, by the director's name is Assi Bendawi. You can find it on Amazon Prime, the, like, video part of it. But yeah, a quote that I you know, kind of pulled from it is where she asks this, like, older woman, do you think you're paranoid? And she says, no, I'm not paranoid. And, like, the way, like, I understood that was, like, you know, you can't be paranoid if the threat is real. It's like, it's not paranoia, it's the threat really does exist within our communities. And so therefore, you know, people are scared, and it's like a legitimate fear. It's not like, you know, just some type of, like, irrational paranoia of this, you know, big man who's watching you. So that's just, like, you know, I think, to briefly touch up on, you know, the impacts on our communities. It also, you know, makes it so that we are now, like, scared to be practicing Muslims, or to come off as these, like, you know, radical Muslims who are, like, we have to almost, like, you know, water down, or, like, you know, talk about Islam, or, like, the way, like, being a conservative Muslim is now, like, seen as, like, oh, okay, this person is, like, you know, is teetering towards, like, scary tendencies or towards certain tendencies. So that's, like, you know, something else that, you know, we can talk about. But yeah, as far as, you know, also the cases that we work on, so you have, like, you know, pre 9/11 and post 9/11, and when we're talking about war on terror, that's obviously post you know, post 9/11, but it's not to say that these cases and similar situations weren't happening prior to 9/11. So now you have what's called, you know, preemptive prosecution, where the FBI and the US government is now, you know, actively going out, they're sending informants into our communities to try to, like, create and, like, manufacture these, like, terror plots, or these, like, you know, big, like, these big things that are happening, like, okay, like, we need to go find the terrorists. And so they literally go and they'll send informants where, like, they try to, like, entrap you into, you know, like, planning this act of terror, which otherwise would have never even been planned or even thought of not being planned, if you know what I mean. Yeah, so basically, but then you also have cases in which, the government is criminalizing charitable giving, like the Holy Land Foundation 5. You know, as far as the Holy Land Foundation 5 goes, sorry, in that case, I don't know how many of you, I'm sure many of you already know about the HLF5, but as far as the HLF5 goes, it's a case where the government literally, went after this very known organization and, basically prosecuted them for giving charity. And it was under the idea that by giving this charity to Palestinians, to, people who are, whether they're widows or orphans or, people going to school or whatnot, or like they're, funding the building of schools and all these different projects, they're freeing up money for Hamas to carry out whatever alleged crimes that they're saying that Hamas carries out. And that basically is what implicated the Holy Land Fund, these 5 men, which are all very incredible men that you can honestly reach out to if you wanted to, and you can, speak and have relationships with with them if you want to. We now basically have 5 men serving between 15 and 65 years, 2 of them serving the harshest punishment, which is the 65 years. If you want to, be more engaged in like what they do, I recommend going to Shukri Abu Bakr's blog, which is called Notes from Shukri. It's like a WordPress website. You can go there and you can see his poetry. He writes very amazing poetry, and is just an incredible writer all around. And you can also go to Instagram, where his daughters are managing a little like store, you could say, where they sell his handmade masabih, or like prayer beads. They're very beautiful. They're honestly just beautiful to look at. So if you want to see it and not necessarily buy anything, I would go to their Instagram page, which is at Bread and Beads. Yeah. And then also, if you want to learn more about the HLF5, you can also go and buy Miko Khaled's book called Injustice, the Story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. I think like the details of this case are extremely, extremely awful and egregious. And you should definitely, take it upon yourselves to learn more. And if I'm going to give you guys my email towards the end, so you guys can obviously, connect with me and get whatever info. And I also see that they're linking the stuff that I'm mentioning in the chat, so that's great. Yeah, and another case that I guess I want to talk to you guys about is Sami al-Arian's case. When we say that this organization was founded by a former political prisoner, that former political prisoner being Sami al-Arian. To learn more about his case, you can go watch the documentary USA versus al-Arian. This is honestly, I think like watching that documentary and then also reading, the book about the HLF5 really kind of showed, it draws so many parallels and lines between Palestine and like the United States and our political prisoners here and, their political prisoners there, and just kind of seeing, all the parallels and lines, and also like just how connected, this oppression is, whether here or there. But basically, Sami al-Arian was a political activist, and he was very well known nationally. And this is what made him a target for basically, but a target of the government, is because he was very impactful in his work. And I think this is something that we see between the HLF5 and then also Sami al-Arian, is where they were very, very successful in making, conversations about Palestine, and then also just like, this image of Palestinians being these like great, amazing people, very mainstream. And so, people were kind of seeing this, and obviously the ADL couldn't, I want to say lost their shit, but I don't know if that's okay. But that's basically what happened. And that's essentially like, what made them a target and what had the government going after them. So, in Sami al-Arian's case, I think it's like extremely, very like, I think eye-opening to see the documentary, like for me, just seeing like, so with Sami al-Arian, there was 2 trials. The first one in which he was acquitted, and it was very, I think, shocking when I saw they interviewed one of the jurists, and they asked him, it was a guy, they asked him, what would it have taken to like come out with a guilty verdict? And he literally just says evidence. Like it would have taken evidence. It's because these cases are literally so like bogus and just ridiculous that like, listening to the facts of the case is absolutely like, it's just harrowing, and it's ridiculous to watch. yeah, so other cases that I would honestly like want to mention right now is the Fort Dix Five, which you know, this is a case that had informants in it, and over here you kind of see like if you read about the Fort Dix Five, and I can link articles. I have like 2 articles that I was going to link to you guys. I'll also put it in the chat once I'm done talking. But the Fort Dix Five, like you have one of the guys who was convicted literally, you know, after being approached by this informant that's trying to convince him to carry out this terrorist plot, he literally goes and he like reports him to the FBI, and he says, hey, like, by the way, I think you should know this guy is trying to get me to do this plot with him. And so he's planning this plot, and like, this is what he's doing. And he's still serving 35 years, you know, of this prison sentence that, you know, in which case we just see so many cases in which the government literally just like falsifies and makes up stuff that, like, you know, that didn't even happen. Like, it's like, okay, like, you know, they kind of go off of like the sliver of like, well, you said you criticized like the United States, like foreign policy here. And that's like really what they're going off of, and what they're basing this huge like fairy tale of a story like off of, and saying like, you were going to do this. And they start basically creating this crime that never even happened, or that, you know, that you were planning to commit. Yeah, and just someone else's name that I want to mention is Ahmed Abu Ali, which is like, you know, a very egregious case that happened here in the United States, in which this man was he's a Palestinian man that was studying in Saudi at the time, and was taken and tortured by Saudi mukhabarat, which is like, you can say like informants or like CIA type people, which later we find out was actually also US FBI. And essentially they coerced a confession out of him that says that he was planning on assassinating the President Bush at the time, George W. Bush. And they took him, it took a while before they brought him to the US, but then he underwent trial here in the United States and was sentenced to a life sentence, and is facing essentially life imprisonment in solitary. So that's the facts of that one is also extremely egregious, and I'll link an article in the chat about that as well. Yeah, so I don't want to keep going for too long, but I kind of just also want to talk to you guys about ways that you can support our work and our prisoners. Something that you guys can do is you can join our pen pal program. I'll also link details about that, but honestly, if you want me to send you you know, direct info, just send me your email in the direct message, or I'm going to also include my email there so that you can, you know, just reach out and just, you know, say that you want info about whatever whatever certain thing it is you want info about. But something that you can do is you can join our pen pal program. You know, this is basically a program where you are paired with one of the prisoners that we support, and you would carry out this, like, you know, social friendship with them, in which, you know, you write back and forth with them, and you would be expected to write them at least once a month. But yeah, and I mean, obviously that relationship can really go, you know, as in depth or as like, I don't want to say shallow, but really as shallow as possible would be just like once a month writing, and very basic, you know, friendship. But yeah, I think that's a huge way that you can support our prisoners. They're in strong need of social connection. I think that's like one of the most important things and important ways that you can support them. But you can also support them financially. You can also, you know, you can provide them with financial assistance and send them money directly, or you can send them books, or you can like spend money on their education, or you can donate to CCF and the work that we do. You can also support them by being informed. So I mean, like, you know, this is a good step in the right direction, but there's a bunch of articles that are being linked, and, you know, documentaries that you can watch just to be informed and to inform others. You know, like I mentioned a couple of times, one of the biggest issues is that people shy away from the issue and don't want to be associated with it, don't want to talk about it, you know, or you know, out of fear. But, you know, at the same time, it really it really hasn't protected anyone, you know, staying silent or keeping away from it. And I think we will be so much stronger and better off together, and by actually talking about the issues. You can also follow our social media. So like I said, we do like a bunch of webinars, and we talk about a lot of different things if you want to learn more. There's so many people that are very, very articulate, maybe more, a lot more articulate than I am, and can go into a lot of depth on a variety of issues. So our social media handles are all at Civil Freedoms, which I can also mention in the chat. And you can follow all of our social medias to see all of that. Yeah, that's it from me. I hope I kept that under 20 minutes.
That was amazing, Nada. Thank you so much. Does anyone have it? I have a couple, but I'll open it up in case anyone.
Oh, and if you have a question, feel free to put it in the message it to one of the hosts or raise your hand and we can call on you. If you want to unmute and ask a question, you can raise your hand. But if you want one of us to read out loud your questions, you can message it to either Celine or me.
I guess while we wait, I'll just ask, is there anything that the Coalition for Civil Freedoms is doing like this weekend for in commemoration of Palestinian Prisoners Day, or any webinars y'all are doing this week that we can help amplify and support?
I don't think we're doing any webinars this week that I know of. Sometimes we do like pull things together last minute. So if we do, I'll definitely send you a message with like the info.
Thanks so much. And where can we find all, like y'all have done like a series of amazing webinars too. Where can we find those if we want to share them with the attendees here?
Yeah, so you can find almost all of them on our Facebook page. So like you just go back, they're all like recorded and posted. We also have a YouTube channel where we post them. So I can also link you the YouTube channel.
Okay, I'll look for those right now and I'll link them in the chat. So no worries. Thanks, Nanda.
Yeah, no problem.
Anyone else have questions or comments?
Reminder, yeah, if you have a question or comment, you can raise your hand, or you can message me or Celine and we can read it loud. We can message it straight to Nanda. And while people might be typing, I have a question too, if that's okay. So I think that it's, I'm just wondering why is it that this notion of political prisoners is so, I think itself so politicized, where the US will talk about political prisoners in like Iran or in China and act like US doesn't have political prisoners, or that incarcerating people in the US in general is not political. And I feel like for what I am hearing as well, especially from Fatima's introduction about political prisoners or Palestinian Prisoners Day, for Palestinians, there's a acknowledgement or there's a assumption that anytime you're incarcerated by Israel, you're a political prisoner. And I just wonder why there is this sort of shame and turning back here in the US context, and this notion that if somebody's incarcerated, it's their own fault. And that, people don't realize that, even by the most strict definition of political prisoners, there are still Black Panthers in prison. There are still, all the people that you mentioned as well. But then there's also this larger war on especially Black and Indigenous communities that is waged through incarcerating them.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering why that difference is there.
Yeah, I think that's like a really good question. I think as far as like prisoners, especially within Palestinian society, like, we hold our prisoners in such high honor, and it's always, the way we like speak about our prisoners is with such high esteem, and like the way that we welcome our prisoners home, like, that's like really just seen in like every aspect, and the way I've like seen people that literally like will disown their kids that don't like end up going, it's like, oh, like that means you haven't been active enough in like Palestinian society if you are not sent to prison. It's something that's super, I think, like mainstream in Palestinian society, and is looked at very differently than like, for example, in the United States. And I also regularly say that, while, I mean, like you said, in the most strict definition of political prisoner, we have political prisoners here in the United States. It's just so much harder. I mean, not harder, but it's just obviously not recognized by the U.S. Like none of our prisoners are recognized by the U.S. as political prisoners, and that's something that we kind of we place that label on them, and by our own definitions. But yeah, I think there's like a very different type of conversation that's happening around like US prisoners and why they are prisoners. But I really think that at the end of the day, all prisoners are in prison for political reasons. And there's some type of political association to why even a prisoner who's convicted on drug charges or whatever else it might be, there's still a political background and ties that need to be discussed and like addressed as to why they are in prison and what that means. But I think there's definitely like I want to say like a hierarchy of the way like people discuss prisoners and how like the blame that they place on the prisoner themselves and like the what that means and the implications of it. But yeah, I hope that answers the question or addresses it at least.
Thank you. And we also have a question from somebody messaged it to me. A clarifying question for you is, how can we get involved with the Pen Pals program? They missed that part when you explained it.
Yes. Okay, so you can send me your email, or I'm about to send you guys the link to watch the Pen Pal orientation, and then also a link to where you can sign up. So I'm planning on sending an email to people who like request the info. I still haven't sent it, but there's like a couple of people who have like requested info for it, which I'm gonna send them this info directly. But I'm also gonna link it here in the chat for you guys to see. So there's like a link for the orientation that you can watch, and then there's a link for a Google form that you can fill out after you've watched the orientation and sign up that way.
Thank you. Just a reminder to everybody, thank you so much for your generosity in answering these questions. But if you have any questions for Nada, you can either message me or Celine to read it out loud, or you can raise your hand using the raise hand function and we can unmute you to ask your question.
Thank you so much for the work that UNCF are doing, and a lot of us I'm joined to tune into the CCF's Pen Pal program orientation, and we'll be joining. So really encourage you all to do the same and to sign up. And again, we have linked all the like resources and materials where you can learn more about CF's work and continue.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to Nada, to Fatima, and to Celine. Well, Celine's sticking around at least to co-facilitate, and Nada and Fatima, you're also welcome to stick around to participate in the next activities. But if you have any more questions, you can also message them to Nada while Nada's here. And we're going to transition to the next activity, unless I missed somebody. No? Okay, we're gonna transition to the next activity, which is a collective look at some risk assessment tools that are used in the LA context to surveil youth. Awesome, thank you, Nadia. So I'm gonna share this research that we've been starting to do that is around this subject. Let me share screen. So I wanted to basically just give a brief overview of these risk assessment tools and what risk assessment tools are. And then I was just going to invite us all to look at the risk assessment tools that these programs use together. And then we're going to, actually, we can even do that right now, is open up the chat so that if people want, even during the presentation, to comment about anything that's jumping out at them, any questions, any sort of like, hopefully I just opened it up right now. Any words of interest or any kind of phrases that are jumping out, this is the part where we fully invite you to be as participatory as possible. But basically, looking at risk assessments used by LAUSD or the school district in LA City through their School Threat Assessment and Response Team, or START, as well as Los Angeles's Gang Reduction and Youth Development Office, which basically is a tool. This tool is used to try to assess which youth are at risk of being violent at school, and the other one is to assess which youth are at risk of joining a gang. So first, starting with the School Threat Assessment and Response Team, what we've uncovered is that, so this is based on the school shooter narrative. And to briefly, say the most obvious thing about the school shooter narrative is most school shooters are white. And most people targeted under this framework, as we'll see when we look at the demographics of the referrals to START, white youth are disproportionately under-targeted, and as to be expected, and Black youth are especially targeted. So based on the school shooter narrative in 1999, LAUSD came out with these guidelines, which involved the creation of multidisciplinary teams, which is a key theme in CVE programs as well. And these consist of an administrator, a counselor, a cop, and also consultation with the LAUSD administration Office of General Counsel. And then START was created about a decade later, and it has all of these partnerships with different law enforcement agencies. So it's most directly a partnership between LAUSD, the Department of Mental Health, and LAPD. But as we'll see in a second, they have all these other partnerships. So here's some quotes I was able to uncover from one of their own reports. They claimed START recently established a memorandum of understanding with the Los Angeles Unified School District and LA Police Department to collaborate on students of concern. And this partnerships with law enforcement agencies and educational institutions are currently underway. The local Federal Bureau of Investigation Office has partnered with START to develop a regional approach to targeted school violence. This effort will formalize our effort with college campuses. So they actually work with the LA County Community College Network as well. So here are some of the different institutions they collaborate with: LA Sheriffs, community colleges, this DHS Fusion Center, or basically the local spy center of the Department of Homeland Security. And then two associations I actually don't know that much about: the Assessment Response Partners Collaborative and the Threat Assessment Regional Group Evaluation Team, called Target, of course. I don't really know anything about either of those. So here I was able, one article listed their open cases in the year of 2019, and I just put that next to the demographic info for LA County at that time. So as you can see, so the red is LA County and the blue is the START cases. So if you look at, for example, Black youth, they're overrepresented by almost double. So 12% of START cases rather than the 7% in the population. And white youth are underrepresented, and this is their own demographic labels. So I just used, because it's hard to disaggregate this specific thing. And then here are some other quotes I was able to get from START. So here this lists the risk assessment tools they use to surveil youth. So this one that is the most common, I think, is SAVRI, which is the Structured Assessment of Violence Risk in Youth Risk Assessment Tool. However, I don't have access to this because I think you got to actually be a counselor in order to download it. So I would love help to figure out how to do that. But I have their kind of like their own risk assessment tool that was made and modeled after the Secret Service one. So, and then they were also briefed on a terrorism specific risk assessment tool. And one of they label their services as close monitoring of potentially violent individuals, development of threat management plans and interventions specific to individuals at these schools. And just to show its relevance to CVE, basically a DHS funded group, which included a researcher at UCLA, as well as the START program. It's also called START, but it's a different START, in the University of Maryland. basically they recommended that in LA, the best place to implement CVE is through the School Threat Assessment and Response Team, START. They said that this program, as well as the Department of Mental Health, has the best resources to implement CVE, and they recommended expanding it to include violent extremism. Here's another quote that they included in one of their books. The steering committee has plans underway to work with the LA County Department of Mental Health to expand the school violence program into a broader violence prevention program that includes expertise on violent extremism. So here are some of my current questions about START, which are, what are the connections between START and providing alternatives to hinder extremism, which is LAPD's kind of boutique CVE program? How many of the referrals of youth have ended up in, fusion centers or have gone to the FBI? How many youth have faced harmful impacts of surveillance and policing as a result of START? And also, have START already implemented risk of factors and indicators specific to extremism? Or is it still sort of general school violence? And to what extent did we actually stop this program when we defeated the grant in 2018? Or did we just stop the efforts to expand the program? In other words, does the program still exist in some capacity? So before we move on to GRYD, I actually just wanted to ask, does anybody here, and we opened up the chat too, so feel free to post in the chat, have any experiences or knowledge about START, the School Threat Assessment and Response Team? Maybe you work with LAUSD, or maybe you've encountered it in some form or have any knowledge, because we're still learning about it as this War on Youth campaign. So any knowledge you all bring would be very useful too. Another question is also, what things are jumping out at you as you learn about this that seem particularly important to combat? What do you feel like is the aspect of this that is the most, ominous to you?
There's a message here that says government stalking
Government stalking, yeah.
and targeted individuals.
Mm-hmm. And remember that you can also raise your hand to make a comment out loud too. And it's completely okay if you are in the mood to listen and not to share right now too. Cool. Maybe we'll move on to GRYD right now, and you can feel free to pop in the chat and say, oh, I see a comment that was like, what is the impact specifically on refugees too, of START as well? And we have another raised hand from Lulu. Hamid, how do you allow somebody to unmute?
I think I unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I guess like my question or comment or the thing that like pops up a lot when I talk to people about this is like, well, how do people not feel as paranoid when they hear those things? Like, people becoming political prisoners for giving charity, right? And like giving back to their homeland or helping people. Like, how do we still encourage people to come out and organize when they fear those things? But like, obviously these surveillance programs are put in place to make people fear, like, organizing and protesting and such things.
So the fear is intentional, in other words.
Yeah.
Does anybody have a response or advice to that? Hamid, do you think you could say a little bit about the sort of like the coalition's power, not paranoia, and also how we've also transformed that, but sort of that philosophy of how we deal with learning about this?
Sure. Well, you just said that. So I think how do we turn paranoia into power? And fear is real. Feeling paranoid is real, and just feeling that sense of being watched, all of that, and that's a part of targeted sort of surveillance. That's very much a part of, I think, what Nina was talking about earlier around, just making feel people so they will self-surveil themselves as well. But I think the goal for the coalition always has been that in order for us to fight back, we've got to know our fight. And in order for us to really organize and help build that power. So yes, I mean, a lot of these things, and particularly when we take on, a global enterprise of imperialism and violence and state violence, I mean, there's definitely risks involved. But yet at the same time, as we continue to fight back, it's really about knowing our fight. And that's what our goal is through these webinars. And that's exactly what I appreciate the way you're talking about it, Akhil, to knowing the details as to where our fight is and how do we then build that power and collective knowledge. Because that's the whole idea, is for them to really keep us silent and keep us really kind of just quiet and keeping our head down.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. We have a question in the chat, which is, are there school community members, parents, teachers, etc., organizing in LA to end school partnerships with police and intelligence agencies? Absolutely. And I know Students Deserve is doing really important work to try to defund specifically the school police. Does anybody know specifically if there are people working on this sort of connection to the Department of Mental Health and the targeting of youth under this, threat assessment tool process? Oh, Celine, go for it. Celine's raising.
Yeah, I guess basically, so the folks focusing on ending these types of collaborations between schools and like the referral programs between like education and law enforcement is, I think it's basically, it's groups like Students Deserve. Also, like, our campaign is focused on particularly ending CVE and PVE in schools. So that would be Stop LAPD and PYM. And we can link our campaign interest form. There's also groups like Vigilant Love, which are looking at the Department of Mental Health more. And we all generally collaborate together a lot around ending national security programs as they're being pushed in our schools and social services and faith spaces and community spaces. So if you're interested in getting more directly involved, I'd encourage you to fill out the campaign interest form, because we do host like working meetings and strategy meetings every month in addition to this meeting. So I'll link that in the chat.
Thank you. I'm gonna just show the GRYD stuff as well. And then I also wanna share with you the actual risk assessment tools too, so that we can look at those together too. But feel free to keep on putting your questions or comments or even just thoughts into the chat related to this as we share. So GRYD's risk assessment is called the Youth Services Eligibility Tool. So GRYD, the Mayor's Gang Reduction Youth Development Office, which basically is kind of like a CVE program, but on the gang narrative. In other words, it still considers sort of youth as on off-ramps to, instead of becoming violent extremists, to becoming gang members, and tries to sort of intervene with services, counseling, etc. And I think that it's hard we have to make sure that we understand that even the efforts that are benign or seem benign here are tied to stigmatizing or surveilling youth because the state believes that they are, sorry, one second. Because the state believes that we are, that the youth that they're surveilling are on a pathway to becoming part of a gang. So this specific tool is created with a lot of academic complicity. So you have USC working on creating this risk assessment tool in collaboration with the City of LA, Liberty Hill Foundation, and USC research funds. And basically the goal is to identify youth at risk of joining gangs. So they created 3 different things. They created the gang risk of entry factors, which is a generalized risk assessment tool. And then the youth services and eligibility tool, which is specific to LA, as well as what they call the social embeddedness tool, which is measuring a person who's already in a gang about how embedded they are in the gang. And they continue to partner with the city to basically evaluate risk assessment results. Here are some of the YSET risk factors for the GRYD program. So this is what they consider if a youth is demonstrating these qualities, that they are likely to be on an on-ramp, or they're likely to be on a pathway to being in a gang. So you can see it's extremely general. It's also extremely sort of stigmatizing. And then also, actually before I kind of give my opinions on it, what do people think about these risk assessment tools? Which one specifically jumps out at you, and what do you feel about it? And also we have another question in the chat too. I can put that question out there in just a second. So yeah, what do people feel about these specific risk assessment tools too? I mean, not these risk assessment, these specific risk factors. Is there one that's jumping out at you? So, oh yeah. So we see a few different comments. What do they mean by critical life events? I have no idea. And then we have one that says, how are these factors and variables defined? How many of these are used as proxies for poverty and race? Yeah, absolutely. Impulsive risk taking is jumping out. Yeah. Impulsive risk taking, absolutely. I have no idea what guilt neutralization is either. So we have a comment that says weak parental supervision and the way it will target single parents and working class folks. Antisocial definitely can be targeted against folks with disabilities, especially. And Nadia says, I think they keep it vague for a reason, to be able to more easily criminalize folks. Like critical life events can be so many things. A comment, hypocritical are the ones that with the monopoly on violence see guilt neutralization as an indicator. Absolutely, because they neutralize their own guilt all the time. Absolutely. So before we go on to the next slide, we have a couple of questions from earlier too. We have one from Nadia. Actually, Nadia, do you want to say yours first?
Yeah, I was just, well, no, because like what I wanted to just see, maybe we could have the screen up again as well, you know, with some of those terms, but I wanted to ask folks, you know, like maybe if you or someone you know, and of course, like you can keep it as vague as you'd like, but just whether it's about being targeted, you know, through GRYD, through START, or maybe if you don't know explicitly, right, maybe you've heard things. I know, just in thinking about like our PRA process when we create the Public Records Act request, one of the things, you know, to get information, one of the things we try and ask folks and think a lot about is what are some key words maybe that you've heard being disciplined in school, right? Or when you've been like messed with by the cops, harassed, brutalized, whatever. And so yeah, I'm just curious if folks have either experienced or have heard anything that might connect to these risk factors, because a lot of times we don't know specifically, but maybe a certain phrase. So I just wanted to throw that question out there to see. I know for me, my personal answer is like thinking of, since I'm a teacher, just thinking of the ways we're expected to criminalize and quote unquote discipline students, right? So there's like, there's certain behaviors. And so how do these get added to that? So yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there and see if anybody had either experienced or heard about phrases that remind you of this.
Is that right, Nadia, what I just put in the chat?
Yeah, I think that captures it. Thank you. And maybe thinking of the I don't know what folks think about some of the parts around specifically thinking of GRYD, like family gang influence, right? Self-deported delinquency, right? I know one thing in thinking of the narrative shifts, right, of young people being targeted, youth of color being targeted as potential gang members for decades, and still that being part of the narrative. But now it's much more explicitly being woven into the war on terror as well, right? And sort of this anti-violent extremism. But
we also have a question from earlier in the chat too, which is, what role do you think security culture plays in building power, not paranoia? So this is this can be a long-term conversation of what culture do we want to build too. But if anybody wants to respond to that question too, we have 2 questions. Feel free. What role do you think security culture plays in building power, not paranoia? And also, have you ever experienced or heard phrases that remind you of this specific risk assessment process or these risk factors that they're listing? Could we also get a definition of security culture? What that means, just in case, because I would like to also know. Go for it, Celine.
Sorry, I can never unmute myself.
Oh yeah.
I feel like when we talk about security culture, we're also talking about like the concept of security in our movement building. So like not only necessarily like focusing on like how are we secure in our technology or only in our communication with one another, but like how do we build up mechanisms of accountability in our movement work to hold each other accountable as it's needed, so that we can make sure that we're also moving. It's like things like, if you're in a collective or you're a part of a movement, you don't just go off and do things as an individual because that might undermine the collective's work. That's also an issue of like security culture. And I feel like it's also about, it kind of makes me think about the concept of safety in general. If we can, build up ways, make sure that in our relationships, which the relationships are the core to our organizing work. So if we're investing in like relationship building and being really comfortable with each other in terms of like, implementing practices like criticism, self-criticism, where we can effectively protect each other against internal harms in our organizing, that also helps us in strengthening our movement so that we can take on the external fights that we have to take on, if that makes sense. So I feel like it would be actually good to have a longer conversation around like building power, not paranoia, and about security culture in our work, because we're often dealing with things like Zionist backlash in our organizing, or we're being targeted and surveilled. So it might be nice actually, maybe if we want to dedicate one of our War and Youth meetings to focusing on this in particular, and maybe inviting speakers who have a lot of experience in building up like different internal mechanisms and just like security practices relating to the way we organize with each other, and not only to like the tech or the platforms that we're using to communicate. That might be a good conversation for us to have down the line. And I'm kind of scatterbrained because I'm like fasting and hungry, but those are my thoughts. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go for it.
Cool. Yeah, I also, for Nadia's, I was also really thinking about like folks that are like knowing that the state is already surveilling folks and already from really, really young, having folks on list if they are known gang members or have affiliations. And then also how when they do end up, because they are heavily surveilled, they do end up, or they're more likely to catch cases, and then because of their status also creates that, ends up having that result. And so I think, yeah, I think a lot about that with like folks growing up and knowing that a lot of folks unfortunately are struggling back in places that they didn't grow up and don't really have as much ties to, and so that struggle. And then as far as the security culture, I really was thinking as far as the like once you start becoming aware of the fact that the state is creating or does have this history of doing that, from indigenous resistance to COINTELPRO, and then the newer ways in which it happens. I think one really important thing is talking about like security culture and practices that we ourselves can implement within our daily interactions with folks, whether it's knowing that you can provide as much information or not provide as much information to folks that might ask really personal questions within like even movement spaces. And also just, yeah, it's a lot that you can talk about with security culture, but also like what different, as like we become ancestors, what information do we pass on to younger organizers as well to ensure that we are creating those kind of accountability processes.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
I just wanted, I think what you were just saying as well, you know, it really made me think of what building security does mean and look like, right? Because, you know, you'd mentioned the ancestors and so like thinking of then what it means for knowledge to be passed on and passed down. I think it's about like protecting who we are, right? It's protecting our identity, our life, our survival, and like you mentioned, our future generations. And so, so yeah, it just kind of got me thinking then the role we have as people, and then on top of that, whatever it is we do, whether we teach or organize or wherever we work, or even just in talking to the people around us, right? And so, so yeah, what does it mean to really like maintain that? I think is also a huge part of security culture, to like protecting who we are.
Yeah, and these programs always are presented in the name of security too, or in the name of safety. So it's kind of like taking that back and, you know, having control of that ourselves. But yeah, so I just wanted to show a little bit also about how this program, this GRYD risk assessment, was also exported too. So this is a little bit about what we have found out so far about this. But in 2012, basically the mayor of LA signed an MOU with USAID to export LA's gang policing practices, including GRYD, to Central America and other places. So far they've exported these risk assessment tools to at least Mexico, Central America, Caribbean, and Tunisia. And the Tunisia program, which was funded by the State Department through this company called Creative, they adapted the Y set with a couple extra risk factors for violent extremism, and they called it etisal, which I guess is a word in Arabic. And they used it to try to screen youth for being on an on-ramp to violent extremism in Tunisia too. And all of this is basically through this, like, it's through a whole network that USAID is kind of like one of the hubs in, of coordinating efforts internationally to basically collaborate on this sort of like exchange between so what they call street gangs and violent extremism. So this is a USAID document where it kind of shows 3 different risk assessment tools and their different risk factors and indicators. So YSET is the one that was created in LA for gangs. And then SAVRI is the school violence one, which also START uses, as we talked about earlier. And then VERA is a violent extremism risk assessment tool. And this is also used in prison contexts to evaluate which prisoners they feel like are on a pathway to extremism as well. So, I mean, we can take a second and even just look at this chart together to like kind of compare these different risk factors, but it's really interesting to see how they think about how they kind of categorize people and you know, try to identify differences and similarities. They also have a chart earlier that was like, what are the differences between gangs and violent extremism organizations, and what are the similarities? But you can see, so they asterisked ones that they think are the same across all three. So some of these are just absurd. For example, evidently you could be a violent extremist if you believe that there is injustice, you know, or if you feel the need to bond with a group. Yeah, absolutely. You could be, yeah, it's just like absurd. Look at this one right here. Anger at politics, actions of a country. Yeah, Yarden is noting low self-esteem, absolutely. And then Abdul Rahim was saying strong feelings of injustice or grievances, internalized martyrdom. Yeah. So this is for Vera, which I don't know yet how much this one is used in the LA context, but we know that Savri and YSET are both used. And we also know that YSET was adapted for violent extremism in Tunisia, and Savri, they even tried to like figure out like whether this is for START, and they want to see if they can expand this to include violent extremism as well. So it keeps on going here. This is what they consider to be things that prevent you from, you know, going along that path. So if you change your vision of your enemy, so that's all you have to do, everybody, is think of your enemy differently. So this is just one of the comparisons that we have. And then I also just want to show on a map the way that this was exported. So, oh, exactly. Yeah. So here, I mean, you have Central America, you have Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico. This is Jamaica right here. And then there's Grenada right here. These are some of the places we've identified that USAID has exported this. And then here's Tunisia right here. But this is all the ones we know about. There could be more. So some of the conclusions that I feel like we've reached is that this is a constant cloud of experimentation that they're still developing, kind of like how COINTELPRO was actually this whole network of, local police, along with the FBI, developing sort of these frameworks about targeting, different movements as threats to national security. So I think that the other thing that we can see is that LA specifically is a laboratory, and that policing is exported from here, and that CVE is a framework and a way of thinking, and there are lots of different programs that kind of use this framework and may not even use the word CVE. And so here's some questions I still have, which is, how can we show that prevention, which comes in the guise of services and counseling, is also harmful? Also, just looking at this map and thinking about the effort, especially right now under Biden, to support the troops in these countries of cracking down on like migrants and refugees, to basically export or outsource that policing. How is using these risk assessment tools part of that? Knowing that this USAID report came out in 2016, this memorandum of understanding was in 2012, so they were under the Obama-Biden administration. These are some of my questions. I don't really know the answer to this one. Is it part of the effort to curb migration? What are the harms of GRYD referrals? Also, I know that last week, not today, but a week ago, the LA Police Commission announced that the CSP sites have their own referral checklist and toggle for GRYD referral. CSP is LAPD's community policing program, community safety partnership. So LAPD has its own sort of referral mechanism within GRYD through the CSP, which they announced last week. So these are some of my own questions, but I would love to also hear what all of your questions are. And then I want to just also give you all these tools, and whoever can stick around, because I know that many people have to leave for iftar. So whoever can stick around, feel free we can look at the tools together, the risk assessments. Otherwise, you can also look at them on your own, and we can figure out how to organize against this, but what are some of your thoughts or questions on GRYD, as you know, what we've shared so far? Also, we have a question in the chat. Oh yeah, how can we show that prevention is also harmful? But yeah, feel free to, you know, raise your hand, or we can unmute you or put it in the chat. But what are your thoughts about GRYD, and also about this sort of like exporting of this practice of risk assessments to other countries based on the experience in LA? Does anybody here also have any experiences with GRYD specifically, or like teach at a school where GRYD is used, or, you know, anything like that? It'd be really interesting and useful to know about that.
I mean, I've in kind of speaking with folks who, like, I remember this one person sharing with me about how even just like, even through GRYD, even in its like sort of stated intent, which we know is not the actual intent, like I've just heard stories of, you know, of people being forced to go to like report to an officer or somebody, right, in like an enemy neighborhood, right? So if they really are like a part of a certain gang, and almost intentionally then being told they have to then go report in another neighborhood, and basically literally sending somebody possibly to their death. I mean, not to sensationalize the community violence, but we know that that's there, right? And so, and we know the state is part of creating that communal violence as well. And so, so yeah, that's just something in thinking of how, yeah, that was something that came to my mind that I hadn't thought of in a while. One of the many ways that that these programs literally are killing young people.
Yeah. So we have a comment. It's incredibly harmful, of course, because it normalizes a certain social behavior at the start of a young and tender age. Yeah. So I just posted, by the way, the different risk assessment tools. You can look at them, click the links. There's the YSET tool, and I can share my screen and show this too. Here's the one that GRYD uses. And you score your, you know, you're either scored or you score yourself based on these sort of templates, and then you tally it up. Then there's also the START one, which is the one that the school threat assessment team uses. It's actually on page 17 of this PDF, so you have to jump to, oh, is it page 17? Yeah, page 17 of the PDF, and you got to jump to there. Oh, sorry. Okay, let me jump to Fatima. Sorry, a lot of people have to leave. So Fatima, can you tell us about the meeting tomorrow? And then whoever can want to look at this, we can look at it. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, so speaking of CVE and risk assessment and all that, there is an urgent call to action because there's going to be a Board of Supervisors meeting for LA County about whether they're going to accept a grant from the Office of Emergency Services for a Homeland Security grant. And basically it's continuation of CVE, counterterrorism, trying to say that there's a pathway to radicalization and all that. So if folks can either email public comment or call in tomorrow at 9:30, that would be greatly appreciated. And there's like a document, which I'm gonna link below, link in the chat about where you can find talking points and such.
Thank you so much, Fatima. And anybody who needs to go for iftar, go for it. Ramadan Mubarak, and have a great dinner. Do you think we should wrap up and send everybody these, or do you think we should stick around and look at them with whoever wants to stay? Nadia, what do you think?
I mean, yeah, I know we had talked about ending around 7:30 as well, but I'm open to look, or if we want to open it also to see if folks have any announcements to in addition. So I see Chella's down to stay. So yeah, maybe we can look through it. And yeah, and I think just, of course, like Akil was mentioning, folks who need to go, they're welcome to, and also we can stay. So yeah.
And you can feel free to find the YouTube video later, or we can also look at this together in our working meeting. So feel free to stay in touch using the form. Oh, and check out Fatima's calls to action in the chat for tomorrow. And for everybody who has to leave. Okay, yeah, so that sounds good. So let's just open it up, and we'll just continue to look at these together. But let's look at, for example, let's just look at the Y set first. And I would love, as we look at this, to just like point out anything that you think is important or that jumps out at you too. So this is the first part right here. I also put all the links in the chat. So this is the part, it seems like they're trying to assess whether a parent or guardian is weak parental control. I personally find this part really interesting because it's kind of puritanical. It says, did you go out on a date with a boyfriend or girlfriend for the first time? And it's like, why does that make you more likely to be in a gang, you know? Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Also, they're like linking basically if you're like failing in school. Yeah. Here's where they're kind of, I guess, trying to assess whether somebody is like a risk taker. Am I scrolling too fast? You can let me know. See, check this out. This one, number 3, says, it's okay for me to lie or not to tell the truth if it will keep my friends from getting in trouble with parents, teachers, or police. So we have a comment that says, people generally don't like you and find you harmful, which is why they left you. Very harmful to even make that implication. And this is reminding me of the standards in preventing violent extremism, like super vague and basically describing the essence of being a young person or being human. And Fatima says, yeah, no solidarity allowed. Yeah, they're encouraging this sort of idea that you have to prioritize your allegiance to authority over your solidarity with your peers. Also, this one right here, is it okay to beat people up if they hit me first? Or this one right here, it's okay to beat people up if I do it to stand up for myself. Yeah, absolutely. So now they're in the drug war too. So basically they tally these things up too. Yeah, I know, exactly. Remo, yeah, absolutely. So this is what they say that they're, they actually encourage people to take this test in order to get services. So this is actually part of the what I think is really messed up about, the system too, is because people need counseling and services sometimes. People need resources. Sometimes people are searching for that, but in order to get it, you have to sort of like collaborate with this institution that's then going to surveil you. That's a good question, Tiff. So Tiff asked, do they use it to gather info on friends too, like the person's friends? I don't really know. And I am very curious about what additional sort of checklists the CSP site has in their GRYD referrals too. Like how that fits in with this, or if it's something separate. They said they have a checklist and a toggle on they said each CSP site has a toggle on the GRYD, like GRYD, like whatever you call it, like the site. So here is, I hope it's okay that we're jumping to the start one. So this is, whoops, I jumped too far. This is their risk assessment tool that was adapted, as it says here, from the Secret Service and the US Department of Education. So this is not Savry. I was trying to get Savry, but it costs $150, and I think you have to be a psychologist. So I'm not exactly sure how to get it. But I did find this one, which is what they say they also use to like assess youth. So if you look at this, oh yeah, absolutely. So yeah, just reminding people that it's completely okay to leave if you have to eat your iftar. And also our campaign interest form, I'm just gonna put that in the chat one more time. Or Nadia, do you have it handy?
Yeah, I can post it, okay.
Oh, I just found it. Here's our campaign interest form, just to send this to everyone again. And I'll pull up this one again. This is the start one now, the one that is the partnership between the Department of Mental Health and LAUSD. So, this is, I guess, their different categories: motive, justification, communication of intent, preoccupation with violence, history of violence and threats, means and access, suicidal ideation, evidence of increasing violence potential. Wow. So these things on the bottom are considered protective factors. That means that they're like, so there's risk factors according to them, and then there's protective factors that prevent you from like going on this pathway. So they want to try to cultivate these and then surveil people for these. Some of these are also super vague too. Preoccupation with these kinds of things. And referrals from START. So I also have the oh, okay. Yeah, so we have a comment, the suicidal ideation is messed up because people who work with youth by law have to report this to someone. It's like part of the slow transition into making a lot of these behaviors mandated reporting, right? Like in England with Prevent. There's also, this is the referral form for START, and any, like all these different people who are connected to youth can use this referral form. So you can use it if you're like the teacher or like administrator. or a cop. And then there's this whole checklist here too that START uses, which includes media research behavior, including on quote unquote terrorist sites too. Whatever is considered by the school to be a terrorist site. Violent drawings, writings. So all of this is, they're considering this for general school violence, but we foresee that with START, they could expand this to include violent extremism or terrorism specific indicators as well. But yeah, just jumping out of that for any thoughts. Also, we're gonna repost the links in the chat in case people want to check these out themselves. I also included a link for the chart that they showed on the USAID document that was listing the different risk factors for all these different risk assessment tools. But yeah, and also just wondering, for people who have this expertise, maybe from the data-driven fight, what do you think is the trajectory towards using risk assessments in a more and more automatic or automated way, you know? Like basically not just having 3 people in a room like analyzing these, but running them through algorithms and machine learning too. Absolutely. There's a comment, there is no way that this is not biased, can be used to target people of color. Absolutely. And another comment, algorithms will always be as biased as the data given to them and the people who code them. Absolutely. And I'll add, and also as biased as the purpose they were created for and as the system that they were created in. Another comment. I'm so afraid of the rhetoric around machine learning as inherently objective. What can we do to fight against that narrative? That's a great question. In fact, I would want to know if there is somebody from the data-driven team that can talk about how we're combating it. And I'm just gonna try to volunteer some. Shakir, are you there right now? I'm wondering if Shakir, if you can talk a little bit about what the coalition does to try to, especially with the algorithmic ecology tool, to try to show the fact that this is not objective.
Like kind of through thinking about like data points and like kind of whatever data sources.
Yeah, and even our campaigns to sort of like stop the reforming of these algorithmic tools.
Yeah, I mean, and I think risk assessments are like a really good example of thinking about like if you're just organizing against a particular like even just like the criteria, you know, like if you're just trying to attack, okay, like this list of things that trigger more policing and more surveillance, like it's very easy for the system to still keep using those same types of criteria or just same like, you know, excuses for surveilling and criminalizing people, and the same kind of, for example, sources of who's snitching on you or who's watching you, or just even the general power dynamics that exist around the algorithm that help define what those criteria are, that help define like who gets tagged by them or whatever. And so, yeah, I guess I kind of think of it that way, that like just the actual list itself isn't like it's just kind of, yeah, I mean it's obviously not objective, but it's just kind of an instrument, like it's just kind of a veneer, I guess, for like what they're trying to do anyway. And so you have to take on like the broader, all of the forces around it, and also just think of, and it's always more about kind of how it's being used rather than kind of how, you know, fair or objective the criteria is. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of shows that, it's not even that important to get the exact details of what's in each risk assessment, you know?
Yeah,
Go for it.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not important to get it, and it's like also almost not even important like in how they're using it. I mean, it tells us about like the ideology of the state shows up in the like criteria, you know. We can see, oh, like that's coming from a certain notion of who's a other, who's dangerous, who's deviant, like that kind of thing shows up. But the state is just, if anything, like the algorithm we're here, and I think risk assessment tools are, you know, basically algorithms, whether or not they're computerized or, you know, just kind of things that teachers and stuff are told to look out for, that that like it's if nothing else, it's just the kind of cover for what they're going to do. And it all it does, all it adds for them is this kind of claim of objectivity, of saying, oh, we use this matrix, or we use this list, we use this point scaling system, when it's the same kind of just like racialized suspicion of you know, like of the state kind of suspecting some people and going after them. This just kind of allows them a cover of, oh, we like ticked off a couple of boxes. Like even if they didn't tick off the boxes, they would be going after those people, because that's just, you know, that's like generally just hunch-based, suspicion-based surveillance and policing.
Yeah, and evidence of that is the fact that there were so many people on the laser targeted like chronic offender bulletin list that had 0 points according to their risk assessment tool. We also have a comment in the chat. I think one way is also is to also combat. Actually, do you want to just say it out loud?
Sorry, yeah, my bad, I mistyped that. But I think basically what I was saying is I think just flat out rejecting the idea that objectivity actually exists, right? Because I think we, you know, we're just taught so much that, oh, we have to find the objective truth. But the reality is that really what this objective truth is the state's bias. I mean, we all have opinion, and that's something I talk a lot about with my students. And I'm telling them, like, don't ever believe that objectivity exists. It just doesn't. I'm like, of course, yes, things are true, and there's certain things that are true and not true, but that doesn't mean it's missing opinion. It's whose opinion is privileged, whose opinion and bias is used to criminalize then other folks, you know, truths and stories. So yeah, so I think that's one way to push back. I forgot how the question was worded, but yeah, I think that's one way of pushing back against that. It's just completely rejecting this notion of objectivity.
Right.
And can I quickly just add something to
Yeah.
that? Yeah, that reminds, like, so, you know, the algorithmic ecology diagram that the coalition put out with the Free Rads group, like it lists a bunch of ideologies on top, and like the first like layer of these are the ideologies that filter through, and it's white supremacy, it's patriarchy, and scientific objectivity is one of them. It's just this like kind of highly Western notion that like, oh, like through science you can discern truths, when obviously throughout history, like scientific objectivity was used to defend eugenics, was used to defend colonialism and all this stuff. So even just that ideology is something we need to organize against along in the same, and look out for, often in the same ways that we look out for white supremacy, look out for patriarchy, and yeah.
I do want to say though that I completely agree, and that this idea that the risk assessment we need to combat the idea that it could ever be objective, and also we need to understand that it's literally just a tool in the sense because the institution that's using it is going to do the same thing. But I also think it is important to know that risk assessment and threat assessments are like a huge wave right now, and especially with this specific field of countering violent extremism. And so, I mean, just looking at the DHS's grant program from 2020, because they haven't announced their 2021 grants yet. But if I just look up threat assessment, so it happens there, look at all these different times that the threat assessments are mentioned in the DHS's grant round from last year. You know, there's a huge emphasis on threat assessments. And I don't think it's exactly important to understand each specific one, but to understand, you know, why politically there might be such a big turn towards threat assessments right now. And not only locally, but as we've seen through USAID and over the last decade, internationally through exporting this practice. I think it might have to do with sort of like this effort to disguise state violence on a global scale and sort of capture some kind of like never really existing legitimacy. But and then they try to wrap it in a veneer of science and math to make to seem more legitimate and stop people from asking questions and challenging it. Absolutely. So, you know, it's 7:51, so maybe, and oh, here, Nadia just posted the campaign interest form again, and then maybe we can stop for any announcements or any other, sorry, did you want to make any announcements, Nadia?
No, I don't have any specific ones, but maybe, I don't know, I know next week is our general coalition meeting. So just wanted, I know you had mentioned it at the beginning as well, Akhil, so want to invite folks to, and the general campaign meeting, sorry, the general meeting is really where we sort of analyze different political landscapes and bring together the different fights. And yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to add to that. Or any other announcements?
Yeah, just real quickly. So next Tuesday, we are hoping to be joined with our comrades at Mi Gente, where we're going to be mapping out the Palantir ecology. So we would be, that's what next Tuesday's meeting is at 6 o'clock. So it'll be with the Free Rads and Mi Gente and the coalition to map out Palantir, which is a major data processing, data harvesting system that is being used, and it's even becoming more critical as they have the exclusive contract with the Health and Human Services to trace and track the spread of COVID.
Thank you. And also, just to answer the question in the chat, what we're looking at is not PredPol, although it's related, although PredPol is still being used in other cities all over the country, but we were looking at risk assessments, which are related because, as Shakir said, they're also algorithms of a certain kind. But yeah, and also one other announcement, again, to repeat from earlier today, is the call to action tomorrow around the Board of Supervisors. Does anybody have the text for that on hand that we can just drop in the chat one more time?
Akhil, real quickly though, I think maybe
Go for it.
maybe one of the points that Susan is maybe raising is like, is it PredPol again? Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's in the same vein as this veneer of science was used around algorithms. This is now we're looking at these risk assessment tools and threat assessments similarly in the same vein, but also there's a connection because, you know, how Jeff Rantham, who was one of the co-creators of PredPol, is central to the UCLA for doing these, what are those gang, gosh, I'm forgetting the risk assessments around, you know, gang tools.
Thank you. Yes, and he's also been in the process of doing evaluations of GRYD specifically.
Exactly.
Brantingham, the inventor of PredPol. So yeah. So you're totally right, Susan. It is kind of a reincarnation of that, and I didn't realize that. Yeah, let me find this text. So basically it's the call to action is to submit public comment on agenda item 3A to this email below for the Board of Supervisors to ask them to reject this grant from Homeland Security to fund their fusion center. It's the Homeland Security grant funneled through the California Office of Emergency Services. Yes, and there's the bit.ly as well. Although that's not a clickable link, so let me just try to open that up and send the actual link too. Is it working for you? For some reason, it's not working for me. That link.
You know, I typed it wrong. It's PVE. Other than that, sorry.
Oh.
I'm just like trying to, because I'm trying to type it from one of those like little flyers on my
Oh,
phone.
sorry.
I'm sorry.
Here you go. So there's the doc in the chat too.
Thanks. Cool.
Yeah. Cool. Yes, and we generally meet the third Wednesday of the month, although I think we're trying to find a different time this month for our working meeting because of Ramadan. So join the campaign interest form and we'll try to figure out a time that would work for the most people. And then next month, we're not meeting on the second Tuesday, we're meeting on the third Tuesday for an exception to the rule, just because there was a special guest that we want to feature on the second Tuesday.
Yeah, next month on May 11th, I believe that'll be the second Tuesday. We're switching around because we've invited our folks from public health, Professor Bita Amani and Jamie Garcia and some of the other folks as well, to give us the update and latest on what's going on with COVID, and particularly as these other forms of surveillances are expanding around COVID as well. So what does that mean? So yeah. So thank you all for the Warren Youth folks for accommodating that and switching the Tuesdays.
Absolutely. Okay. If there's nothing else, you all get 3 extra minutes of your evening. Thank you all so much. See you. I talk so much, you all. Oh, you're muted.
Okay, stop kicking me out. I'm going. I'm just kidding. And I was like, we gotta go, y'all. No, but yeah, I'm like nonstop Zoom. Oh my God, I've been Zooming since like. But at least this is less pressure.
I had to write in Urdu for Nadia, like, leave now. Yeah. All right, cool.
All right. Bye, y'all. I am gonna leave. My eyes hurt.
Have a good night. Be safe.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Thank
Good
you.
night, everyone.
And this recording should be uploaded probably by Saturday. It should be on
Cool.
YouTube. Great. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.